I call the honourable member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to pay tribute to all who are a part of the fruit processing industry of Australia. Probably some 90% of these people and their enterprises are located in my electorate of Murray. Others, for example, the growers of the navy beans and the sugar producers, are far away in Queensland. Only one Australian fruit processor, SPC Ardmona, remains in business in 2014. They have survived where others have collapsed, victims of the policy failures of successive governments, both state and federal, but soon, I anticipate, these failures are to be addressed by us and they will be something of the past. The failures of these successive governments include the costly and ineffective Australian anti-dumping regime, the failure to use the WTO-sanctioned emergency safeguard measures, which could be in place while the month after month of analysis of anti-dumping churns its way through the Commission. The crippling overvaluation of the Australian dollar, which killed export competitiveness and triggered a flood of cheap, often dumped imports, was also a factor that made a victim of too many other Australian manufacturers. And then there's the massive market power of the biggest supermarkets in Australia, who control over 80% of the retail grocery business, making it almost impossible for the suppliers to have any chance of competing for better prices. These supermarkets' strategies of relentlessly growing their market share through more profitable home brand offerings on their shelves, aided by obscure country of origin labelling, poor at-border food safety inspection and weak anti-dumping protection, mean that in Australia our fresh and manufactured food suppliers are up against it. And these supermarkets compete on ever cheaper prices, with the losses borne, as I say, by their overpowered suppliers. Then there are, of course, and continue to be, the massive increases in energy costs exacerbated by the carbon tax and carbon equivalent tax on refrigerant gases. Between 2010 and 2013, SPCA's sales revenue net of discounts per unit of product sold decreased 4%, as I say, squeezed by the supermarkets, while the unit costs to make and sell increased by around 22%, reflecting the huge increases in energy and other non-wage input costs. How could any of our manufacturers survive in such a perfect storm? And in the case of SPC Ardmona, there were also 10 years of worst drought on record from 2001, followed by the worst year of floods on record, which inundated orchards for some of them up to 12 months. For a succession of recent years, then, you won't be surprised for me to tell you that Coca-Cola Amatil, an Australian-owned company, the parent of SPC Ardmona, carried the losses of the last remaining fruit processor in Australia. Last year, just announced, the write-down of losses from SPCA were an accumulated $400 million. You could have seen other companies walk away with such losses at the demand of their shareholders. And I want to commend Coca-Cola Amatil for understanding the icon status of the last remaining fruit processor, but also its great future prospects, if only it can get through this perfect storm that I've just described. SPC Ardmona management in April 2013 had to walk into their growers' orchards, often into their kitchens or their small offices attached to their cool stores. And some of these family orchards have been with the same people for generations. And the generations came from Italy, Macedonia, Greece, Albania, Turkey, and more recently from the Punjab. And they had to face up to these orchards and tell half of them that they could not take any fruit, not a single tonne, anymore from their orchards. More than 50 growers in the Goulburn Murray valleys then faced, as you can imagine, extraordinary financial distress and for many collapse. They knew flooding the fresh fruit market with their canning varieties of fruit was not an option, and they had to find the funds to bulldoze their apples, pears, peaches or apricots, or they had to continue the costly business of spraying the trees, pruning and picking them, but with no returns. This continues to be a very dark time for those families and the hundreds of workers and the small town communities which depend on their enterprise. And I want to express my deepest sympathy for those who have still this incredible economic problem to overcome, where they have no market for their varieties that are developed for canning, but there is light on the horizon. The remaining 50 or 60 families with their orchards developed specifically for fruit processing and covering many hundreds of hectares, with their cool stores and equipment and their highly developed irrigation systems, they were informed by SPC Ardmona that they would only have half of their fruit taken in the next season, with very few firm prospects for the future. So if you can imagine the extraordinary distress that occurred with over 100 farm families, orchard families, in April last year, being given this shocking news. Obviously, all of our orchardists who have developed for the processing industry face enormous difficulties, with the same drastic employment impacts on the districts and towns where they live. And we thought that was the worst of it, because we imagined that with the huge diminution of the amount of fruit to be taken, at least the factory would be able to limp along, but there was worse to come. Let me tell you about SPC Ardmona. Australia's largest and now last remaining fruit processing enterprise began with the establishment of two grower co-ops, the Shepparton Preserving Company, established in 1917, and Ardmona, established in 1921. In 2002, SPC and Ardmona merged, and in 2005 the processor was purchased by Coca-Cola Amatil when the Australian dollar was about 60 cents compared to the US. The parent company had changed its name from Amatil in 1989. Let me stress, it's not a subsidiary of the multinational Coca-Cola. It's not an American-owned company, but rather, amongst other enterprises, it has a franchise to sell Coca-Cola product in defined regions. Australia's fruit processing sector has always been an innovator, with the Tatura trellising system developed for the orchards, now used throughout Australia, and with Ardmona being the first manufacturer in the world to develop single serves and to put preserved fruit into resealable plastic packaging. This is often referred to as the cannery, but in fact this is a highly innovative and mostly plastic-packed enterprise in the Goulburn and Murray Valleys. The growers who supply the fruit and tomatoes for SPCA are benchmarked as highly productive, in particular the tomato growers, who are benchmarked as some of the best in the world. And for convenience and efficiency, these growers are concentrated within a 50-kilometre radius of the manufacturers in the northern Victoria's Goulburn and Murray Valleys. They grow over 80% of Australia's pears and apples and most of the country's apricots, peaches and plums. This is the food bowl, especially if you focus on the fruit food bowl of Australia. The orchards take advantage of the flat topography, fine Mediterranean climate, good soils, excellent road transport infrastructure and water security provided by the Goulburn Murray system, the oldest irrigation network in Australia. The federal government committed $1.216 billion in 2011 to modernise this irrigation system in order to serve the fruit and dairy industries in the Goulburn and Murray Valleys, and the state put another $1 billion into the same investment into this irrigation system. The towns of Cobram, Kyabram, Maroopna, as well as the city of Shepparton, is dependent on the fruit manufacturing industry, in all over 150,000 people, but directly employed in the factory over 800, and of course directly linked to those 800 at least another 5,000 or 6,000 jobs. This is the equivalent of a Holden in Adelaide, or certainly an Alcoa in Geelong. And given it takes 4 to 7 years, depending on the variety, to grow a new fruit tree to a stage of commercial production, once those people have bulldozed their orchards, they don't come back. You can't afford it, you don't have the time to wait for the trees to re-establish, especially when you're carrying your drought debt from those 10 years of the worst drought on record, and especially when SPCA hasn't been able to pay you very much for the last few years of your fruits production. The tragedy is, from the time of April 2013, with the contract cancellations, 25% of the fully productive pear trees in this area were bulldozed, and since then another 60% or 300 hectares of the canning peaches. This is a catastrophe that most other nations in the world would be shocked at hearing about. How could a country, through market failure, through no fault of the manufacturers themselves, how could a country be bulldozing highly productive fruit trees knowing they wouldn't return? The growers had no other options, of course, but to try and avoid a phytosanitary crisis for their neighbours growing fresh fruit varieties, or alternatively they didn't have the means to keep spraying these trees and pest and disease manage these trees and then bring in the pickers and pruners. Calls on the state government of Victoria to help with these costs fell on deaf ears. So it was a perfect storm that had descended on Australia's last fruit manufacturing industry. And little of this perfect storm could be deflected or influenced by Coca-Cola Amatil, SPC Ardmona, or the growers, their cool store operators, their transport industry, the makers of their cans and plastic containers and their cardboard boxes, Visi, the pickers, the pruners, the packers, all were powerless to influence what seemed to be the only rational thing to do to save further losses for the parent company shareholders. And that was to close the whole business down, literally to turn the Murray and Goulburn valleys into a desert. But in April 2013, the management of SPCA was changed and they did what they could do with business restructuring, one of the few things they could influence themselves. SPC currently employs about 840 FTE staff, or 528 full-time, and 921 seasonal workers at its 3 factories in Kyabram, Mooroopna and Shepparton. The vast majority of SPCA's workforce is in Shepparton, and the decision was taken that Mooroopna and Kyabram factories would shut down. 73 trade-qualified maintenance workers who had not been able to agree on new productivity and flexibility measures saw an announcement in December 2013 that these positions would all be outsourced. The vast majority of other food preservers at SPCA, some 767, have a living wage of around, on average, $53,000 per annum, not a huge amount. And the average award for this group is around some $27,000 per annum. It was not possible for them to be pushed back down to their award wage and for them still to be able to feed their families and pay their home mortgages. The average wage increase agreed in the food preservers EBA by SPC Ardmona from 2010 to 2013 was just 2.4% per annum, which was lower than the negotiated food industry average of 4% per annum and lower than the national average wage increase of 3.4% for the whole of the country. So their wage increases were way below the national and their own industry standards. 110 weekly EBA positions, that's 29% of the total, at SPC Ardmona were made redundant between 2011 and 2013. You can imagine the pain of that 30% of the workforce without their positions anymore. Salaried headcount was reduced by 31% during the same period. This was a very painful but significant workforce restructuring and downsizing made by the management in an effort to maximise efficiency and to save the industry. So the orchardists suffered, the workers suffered, but they understood this was one measure that they could all take in trying to save the last Australian fruit processing industry. And it's not correct to say that SPCA had not made major changes to workforce size, conditions and entitlement, or that they paid exorbitant wages compared to national industry standards, or that their problem stemmed from wages, which was what the Productivity Commission concluded on page 75 of their 20th of December 2013 review and outcome of the Safeguards Inquiry into the import of processed fruit products. They said labour costs, and I quote, are a relatively minor contributor to total cost in SPCA's, and I quote, suffering serious injury. So I've already said that SPCA's earnings before tax were significantly eroded. It declined by over 25 to 30 percentage points between 2010 and 2013 for their key domestic processed fruit categories. This business wrote off more than $300 million in the last several years. This year it has just announced a further write-down of $400 million. This response of the shareholders in not closing this sector, therefore, as I said before, has been magnificent. But what to do? The industry had restructured, its workforce had reduced it by 30%, had removed those off their payroll who they couldn't negotiate with. So they understood what they had to do to survive was to innovate, and they've done that with some magnificent new products. But that innovation requires new machinery and retooling the factory, which, as I have explained, is now to be 1 factory campus instead of 3. These new products require very different equipment. So SPCA, supported by CCA, their parent company, embarked on a four-pronged strategy. The first was to request an innovation co-investment grant from the Victorian and federal governments of $25 million from each, to be matched by $90 million from Coca-Cola Amatil to invest exclusively in the new equipment and retooling. And remember, I'd just been referring to the huge losses that Coca-Cola Amatil's shareholders had been taking. So to invest $90 million into this significantly damaged business or industry was an enormous step for them to take. The Commonwealth chose not to extend this support, but with a $22 million grant from the Victorian government and with $78 million from Coca-Cola Amatil, there is now $100 million to retool and buy new equipment in order to manufacture the new products which are doing so well in their trials. This is going to give us a real new chance of having a market that is beyond the reach of the supermarkets. These new products can be put into the fast food sector, it is hoped, and can be repositioned into the export market as the dollar begins to come down a little. But the cheating at our borders with dumped imports has also to be addressed. SPC Ardmona estimates that if there was fair play in pricing, if the dumped tomatoes, for example, from Italy, were in fact had applied to them the 20% or so margin in terms of tariffs or certainly duties, then they would immediately experience a 25% improvement in their price competition with those dumped products. This is enormous. So SPCA took a case against Italian tomatoes and also South African peaches to the Anti-Dumping Commission, expecting fair outcomes. Of course, they didn't receive that with the case of the South African peaches. The Anti-Dumping Commission found there was dumping, yes, but they used a different methodology to that used with the tomatoes case. They used what we call the weighted average instead of the transaction methodology. So they said there was only 2% dumping of the South African peaches in the way of a margin, and they refused to do anything, therefore, to support SPC Ardmona. New Zealand, of course, took an opposite tack, used a different methodology, and in fact immediately reintroduced anti-dumping actions against South African peaches. In the case of tomatoes, not even our great Anti-Dumping Commission could turn its back on up to 20% dumping margin of Italian tomatoes into Australia. However, it has now been 11 months since SPCA brought this case. Still, we do not have an outcome. The Minister has not received the recommendations from the Anti-Dumping Commission asking that these duties be permanently, or I should say, be imposed for a period of time. So how can any industry like SPC Ardmona, with this massive dumping against it, with the super cheap prices of other products coming in, how can it compete? We're supposed to have a fair play. We're supposed to have a strengthened anti-dumping regime from Labor, and I am so pleased that our Minister is going to make sure that the Anti-Dumping Commission improves its game, reduces the time it takes to look at these cases, reduces the costs that are imposed on Australian industry trying to have a fair outcome. I have to say we also have to address our flawed labelling laws that allow our dumped product to come in disguised as something else under the heading made of local and imported ingredients. We have to have a food safety inspection regime because at the moment we have canned peaches from China allowed into this country with lead levels double the Australian allowable limits. And I'm deeply concerned that those canned peaches in their 3-kilo tins are being snapped up still by the food services sector, particularly in government procurement outcomes, where the cheapness of the food is the most important factor in keeping the hospital or the aged care facility or even the Defence Force canteen afloat. We've got to address all of these things. We have to make sure that when a company like Coca-Cola Amatil does the hard yards with its own restructuring, that the Australian government competition policy is improved so the supermarkets can't take advantage of their market power to drive down prices to their suppliers, to put all of their product into home brand generics, which of course kills innovation and new product development in branded product. We've got to make sure our anti-dumping regimes work, that our quarantine inspection services are based on real concerns about Australian food safety. All of that is important. It must occur. But the good news is that SPC Ardmona is continuing to be producing some of the best foods in Australia.